Tonight, there are warnings that the U.S. is dangerously close to a constitutional crisis.
Morning glory and even grace, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. That was Caitlin Collins. That's nonsense. Rich Lowry, though, editor of National Review, spent the editor's pod on this today. I wanted to cry. I've already talked to Noah about this. I love your... By the way, you're not bandaged. I thought after last week's episode on tariffs, you'd be wearing like bandages around the top of your head. Really? Can you fire those people? You can go all Elon Musk on them. They can't beat you up like that, Rich.
I know. Getting beaten up by my own employees is terrible, Hugh.
Well, let's go to the key issue. Do you think we're anywhere near a constitutional crisis in this country?
No, and very notable in that clip from Caitlin Collins is the use of the passive voice. There are warnings. Yeah, so people are saying it. That doesn't make it true. It's one of these things, Hugh, like we've seen over and over again. We saw so often during the campaign last year where the memo goes out, some catchphrase or narrative or meme is supposed to be the thing. Kamala Harris is supposed to be joyful, or she's supposed to be brat, or Donald Trump is supposed to be too old and unenergetic, and we're all supposed to believe it. They kind of want to make something true through the force of their will, and that's true here. You say, what's the crisis? So Trump is trying to reorganize or pare back or pause or fire some people in the executive branch. He is the chief executive, and some judges are saying, okay, we're pausing this, we're looking at this. That's where we are, right? That's a crisis, and they're hung a lot of it on J.D. Vance's tweet, just saying that the judiciary can't impinge on the executive's legitimate powers, which is not just non-controversial, is a truism, right?
Yes.
Any such decision would be lawless and would be overturned by some other court. So, no, we're not anywhere near a constitutional crisis.
I wish that the vice president had added a citation to Federalist 78, where Alexander Hamilton writes, it's the least dangerous branch, the judiciary. Because they're not very least dangerous right now. They've got Trump blocked in 5 or 6 different lawsuits, but that's not a crisis. I've been teaching con law for 27 years, Rich. And I always say we've had one constitutional crisis in this country. It's called the Civil War. Andrew Jackson got close to having to confront one during the compact theory when John Calhoun wanted to leave and exit. Right. And the New Englanders did that. Those are real issues when the Constitution breaks down. But when courts are having arguments with the executive and the executive is getting ahead of that's not a crisis. That's the way it's supposed to work.
Right. The system, there are these tectonic plates built into the system, executive, legislature, judiciary, and they're going to grind up against one another. That's the way the system is designed. And also, I think, Hugh, we're all we're used now to Musk pace, right? When everything's extremely rapid. So if you have a judge looking at something for a week, in terms of the way the federal government usually works, that's a trifle, right? That's not a delay even worth mentioning. And a lot of this stuff, there's going to be a delay, but I don't think Trump's ultimately going to lose. Now, there may be a big fight about impoundment coming that the Trump people want to set up, and that'll be a big deal. I wouldn't be so optimistic there, but a lot of this they're just going to win on, I think, don't you?
I'm going to penalize the McCarthy report for $5 every time you guys bring up the Yankees or the Mets. We're going to start a tip jar that you guys, it's like the swear jar in the office. You've got to have, every time you guys bring up your particular baseball without talking about the Guardians, there's going to be a tax on that. But you did cover the Impoundment Act. I talked with Andy about the Civil Service Reform Act of 78. I think it's got constitutional problems. Andy also doesn't like the Inspector General's Act. These are, but they're not crises. They're questions that have to be resolved by the judiciary. And I don't believe Donald Trump has ever ignored an order of the court.
He hasn't, no. And there shouldn't be any need to do so here. Again, like in J.D. Vance's hypotheticals, if there's a war with China and we're trying to send the Sixth Fleet across the Pacific and a judge says for some reason you can't do that, you ignore that, right? On the same grounds that Lincoln ignored Taney on habeas corpus, right? There's a real crisis of the nation. But this kind of stuff, you can fight it out. It's not existential. It feels very important now. There's a lot of good work going on. But ultimately, whether these 2,000 employees can be put on leave or not is not a crisis of the regime.
Yeah. By the way, I don't blame Caitlin Collins. Somebody wrote that for her, and they wrote in the passive voice because she probably said, "I don't want to say this," and that's what I think happen because it's such a dumb thing to say. Let me move to a real crisis. I began the show with John and Rachel Goldberg-Pollen, and their son Hirsch was kidnapped and executed. And on Monday, they wanted all the hostages released. They were not as adamant today after Donald Trump and raised their demand, saying come Saturday at noon, the war begins. That is a crisis. It's an international crisis, not a constitutional crisis. What do you see happening there, Rich?
Well, it looks like the deal is breaking down, right? Even if somehow this first phase survives here. And this should have been the attitude of the United States government from the beginning, and this crisis would have been solved by now. Instead, it's been drawn out, and this deal wasn't great. I understand Israel signing on to it, got pressure from all sides, including domestically, which is very, very important. And once a terrorist group has a lot of hostages, the deal's not going to be great. That's just sort of baked into the cake. But dribbling these people out and playing for time and hoping to reconstitute yourself represents obviously a major risk to Israel and all that is gained in Gaza to this point.
I like to point out to people, and I did in the conversation with the Poland, 400 IDF soldiers have died in Gaza since 10/8. So it's been a bloody war, and you do that 30 times 40 would be the American equivalent. It's been a very disastrously costly war for Israel. They can't walk away, and I think we'll back them up. Do you think we'll see and raise Iran, Rich Lowry?
I don't know. That's a bigger proposition. Do you mean actually targeting their nuclear facilities?
Yes, or their oil refineries. Bankrupt them.
I think we want to bankrupt them. I think at some point it's plausible we could sink their navy. I think going and targeting their nuclear facilities is a further step up and a much more complicated and fraught endeavor. So I'm not sure we'll see that.
Right now, I want to go back to the editor. The editors is wildly entertaining, by the way. I listen to commentary. I listen to the editors. I listen to Mary Catherine Hammond Vick. I listen to a bunch of podcasts, but I never miss the editors. And last week's episode on tariffs, I got Charlie Cook on Friday. Said, Charlie, what Rich was trying to say, I think, is that Trump's just messaging. And he's not messaging the Mexican government, the Canadian government, or the Chinese government. He's messaging that people are going to give their life savings to coyotes to get into the country. He's messaging the fentanyl dealer. He's messaging. That's what he does. Mm-hmm. They were being purist on you, and you were talking politics.
Yeah, well, the point I was trying to get across is I wouldn't have done this. I don't like big tariff threats against our allies. And Mexico is a complicated ally, but is an ally still. But I just think at the end of the day, we're going to get the Mexican government to give us everything we want on migration. And maybe there would have been some other way to do it. Maybe there's some way to do it short of going and making this 25% threat. But if you have your government like Mexico and you have this behemoth to your north basically saying, give us everything we want on migration, or you're going to suffer pretty much an instantaneous recession. What are you going to do? That's a lot of pressure. So,
and if you're in the mountains of Guatemala, or you're thinking about flying to Peru in order to take the bus to Guatemala and then cross the Darien Gap in Panama, maybe I've got it backwards, you're going to pause when you see and you hear Donald Trump saying all this. And one of the arguments I had with Charlie, discussion, not an argument, is there are metrics. It's not unfalsifiable. You just have to wait a year to see what happens, because the results in the stats, right? We're going to know how many people crossed illegally, and we're going to know how many fentanyl deaths there are. And if the fentanyl deaths come down significantly, I don't really care what means he used, provided they're illegal. And one of those means is the bully pulpit. I'm kind of happy about this, Rich.
Yes, I think a lot of the messaging was going on even before Trump got elected. The Trump team was not upset about these hysterical headlines in the New York Times. They're going to be camps for illegal immigrants. Exactly to the point you're making. They want people south of the border to see that. Now, wait a minute, we really want to deal with that if this guy is elected again? And sure enough, we've seen that deterrent effect instantaneously the way that we did the first time around. Crossings have basically gone to zero. Now you need a lot of cooperation from the Mexicans and other things to happen to keep it at zero. And I think that's what's going on in these tariff negotiations. We need not just 10,000 Mexican troops at the border. That sends a good signal, but the Mexicans to reinstitute remain in Mexico to police their southern border, to send illegal immigrants that are in their country trying to get across our border, send them out of Mexico entirely instead of just sending them to the south to do this whack-a-mole and come up within Mexico again. And I think there's a pretty good chance we're going to get all of that now that we have Mexico over a barrel with this tariff threat.
I agree. And I think that's what he did, and I think that's what he intended to do. Rich Lowry, great addition of the editors this morning and last week. Keep going at it Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Thanks to you.
The editor.